On Monday, three of Japan's biggest department store operators reported their annual earnings. The numbers were brutal. Takashimaya, a 195-year-old retail institution, posted its first net loss in 5 years. Front Retailing, which runs Daimaru and Matsuzakaya, saw net profit plunge 70%. Matsuya, the Ginza icon, reported a sharp profit decline. And they all pointed to the same culprit: China.
Not a recession. Not a supply chain crisis. A diplomatic spat over Taiwan that turned into a full-blown consumer boycott.
Here is what happened, what the numbers actually tell us, and why this story matters far beyond department stores. In November, Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi made a statement in Parliament that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could constitute an existential crisis for Japan under its security legislation. It was not a new legal position. Japan's defense establishment has said similar things for years, but Takaichi said it out loud on the record, and Beijing responded with fury.
China's consul general in Osaka posted threatening remarks on social media. Beijing demanded a retraction. Takaichi refused. And within days, China issued a travel advisory warning its citizens against visiting Japan. Macau and Hong Kong followed with similar notices. By January, the effects were impossible to ignore.
Chinese visitor arrivals to Japan collapsed, 60% year-over-year. In a single month, January 9, Chinese tourists dropped from nearly 1 million to just Sanspaf.
For Japan's department stores, it was catastrophic. Chinese tourists were not just visitors, they were the highest spending demographic in the entire tourism ecosystem. In 2004, China accounted for 0% of all foreign visitor spending in Japan, roughly 600 billion trillion yen out of a record 600 billion trillion yen total. The average Chinese visitor spent around 1,200 yen per trip, well above the overall average of 1,200 yen.
And they did not spend that money at ramen shops. They spent it at department store duty-free counters, luxury handbags, high-end cosmetics, Japanese whiskey, electronics, the kind of high-margin goods that department stores depend on to offset their enormous real estate and staffing costs.
When that spending vanished, the damage rippled straight to the bottom line. Takashimaya's duty-free sales dropped 2%. Front Retailing's Daimaru and Matsuzakaya stores saw tax-free revenue fall 2%. Industry-wide, duty-free sales at Japan's major department stores had been growing every year since the pandemic. That streak broke in late Nitennichou, and by early Nitennichou the decline accelerated.
The Japan Department Store Association reported that total duty-free sales in July Nixan Asawu were ordered Munitsan 50 and san billion yen, down 30% from the same month in Nixan Asa 50 and san 50 and sang 50 and san 50 and sang 50 and san 50 and san 50 and san 50 and san 50 and sang 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 50 and sang.
But here is where the story gets more interesting. Because Japan's tourism industry did not collapse, it adapted. Total inbound visitors to Japan hit 6 million in Nitian Arsuwov, a new record, even as Chinese arrivals cratered in the final months. How? Other markets surged. South Korea sent 1.3 million visitors in January Arsuwov alone, up %. Taiwan was up 16%. The United States rose %. Even Southeast Asian arrivals climbed steadily.
By February, Nichiren Arsuliu, Japan, set a new record for February tourism arrivals despite the Chinese boycott. The Japan National Tourism Organization reported that overall arrivals were running 60% above pre-pandemic levels.
The problem is not volume, it is spending patterns. Korean and American tourists visit Japan in large numbers, but they do not shop the same way Chinese tourists did. They eat more, experience more, and buy less luxury retail. A Korean tourist might spend heavily at a convenience store or a local restaurant. They are less likely to walk into Takashimaya's Nihonbashi flagship and buy a $10 handbag.
This is what makes the department store crisis so revealing. Japan built its post-pandemic retail recovery on a very specific assumption that Chinese spending would keep growing. The numbers supported it. Duty-free sales hit a record $1 billion look for $4 billion yen in Nalseanis 4 up %% from the previous year. Department stores were renovating their duty-free floors, hiring Mandarin-speaking staff and tailoring their product mix to Chinese preferences. It was a golden age.
And then one diplomatic comment ended it. The stores are fighting back, but the pivot is not easy. Isetan Mitsukoshi Holdings reported that duty-free sales rose 5% in March. 10 years look the first positive month in a while. Takashimaya saw a 2% increase. Front retailing's tax-free sales climbed 10%. The Japan Times called it a tentative rebound. But these gains came off a deeply depressed base, and they were driven by Korean and Taiwanese shoppers spending at lower price points.
The real question is whether Japanese retail can diversify fast enough. Some stores are shifting their luxury floors to appeal to wealthy domestic customers and Middle Eastern tourists. Others are investing in experiential retail, turning their spaces into destinations rather than just shopping venues. Mitsukoshi's Nihonbashi store, for example, has been expanding its art galleries and cultural event spaces.
There is a broader lesson here, and it goes well beyond department stores. Japan's entire inbound tourism strategy was built during a period when China was the dominant growth engine. The government's target of $1 billion trillion yen in annual tourism revenue by Norsen Sanshu assumed Chinese visitors would keep coming in ever larger numbers. That assumption now looks fragile. The IMF noted last week that Japan's economy is displaying impressive resilience and that rising interest rates reflect a healthy economy. GDP growth is forecast at 10% for Nisen ni Shilukdain, but the IMF also flagged the Middle East conflict as the greatest growth headwind for Japan, given its energy dependence. Add a sustained loss of Chinese tourism spending on top of that, and Japan's consumer-facing sectors face a pincer movement: rising costs from energy imports, falling revenue from their best customers. The irony is that Japan's tourist boom was supposed to be the antidote to its demographic decline. Fewer Japanese consumers, no problem. Import demand from abroad. That logic works, but only if the demand is diversified. When 90% of your tourism revenue comes from a single country that can turn the tap off overnight for political reasons, you do not have a tourism strategy, you have a vulnerability.
Consider the scale of the adjustment required. China exported roughly 13 billion in tourism spending to Japan in Nithan Mihon Wudane. Even a 1% reduction in Chinese arrivals wipes out more than 2 billion annually. To replace that through Korean and Taiwanese visitors alone, Japan would need those markets to grow by another century to 2%, a steep ask even with the weak yen working in its favor.
The March rebound in duty-free sales suggests the worst may be passing. Beijing has not formally escalated beyond the travel advisory, and some Chinese tourists are still coming despite the warnings. But the structural lesson is clear. Japan's department stores, and the broader economy they represent, need a customer base that no single government can veto.
The earnings reports released this week are not just retail news, they are a case study in what happens when economic strategy meets geopolitical reality. And for Japan, the question is no longer whether Chinese tourists will come back. It is whether Japan can build a retail economy that does not need them to.